didactic series. This series is hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. We're so glad to have you all here joining us today. My name is Julie Brovko. I'm an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. So first, I want to remind you to join us next week. At that time, Dr. Ryan Wagner is going to be presenting Cause and Effect, Establishing Causation in Personal Injury Cases. Next, for our talk today, again, please ask questions in the Q&A anytime you feel comfortable, but just know we're probably not going to get to them until the end. As always, we try to answer as many of your questions as possible, but please forgive us ahead of time if we can't get to yours. As Anthony mentioned, for those of you that want CEUs but are on a tight schedule, you do have to stay for that full hour, but you don't have to stay longer than that. So I'll let you know when that hour has passed, but just know we'll be staying on longer to answer questions. So now it's time for what we've all been waiting for. I'd like to introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Michael Lamb. Dr. Lamb is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Cambridge. He has long focused on the importance of child-parent relationships in diverse family and child care contexts and on factors that enhance or diminish children's capacities as witnesses, especially of abuse. That work has helped shape the law and practice in relation to post-divorce relationships between children and parents, fostering adoption, and parenting by LGBTQ adults. Developmentally appropriate forensic interview techniques and cross-examination of young victims and witnesses. His research has earned multiple awards, including from the American Psychological Association for Psychological Science and the Society for Research in Child Development, as well as honorary degrees from a number of universities around the world. He currently edits the APA journal Psychology, Public Policy, and Law. Dr. Lamb, we're so grateful to you for sharing your time and expertise with us. On behalf of the University of New Mexico, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for presenting today. I'm now going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Julie, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon to you, and good late morning to those of you who are in the west of the country. It's a real honor to be with you today to give this talk. I want to emphasize at the outset that what I'm planning to provide today is a 36,000-foot overview of the research literature in this topic. So I'm going to be going very quickly through material without the time to give proper credit to the many hundreds of researchers and scholars whose work I've drawn from and learned from over the years. That said, I do want to note that to the extent that I talk about some of the research that I've done myself, it's been done in cooperation with a number of really important colleagues, of whom I want to draw special attention to Kathy Sternberg, Philip Esplin, Reed Hershkovitz, Yael Orbach, and Deirdre Brown, who have been involved in this research for decades now. So as I said, what I want to do is to give you a very quick overview of what we know about child witnesses, about their capacities, about the factors that affect the quality of information they're able to provide, about their experiences, including experiences of abuse. I also then want to talk about what interviewers typically do and what they can do to elicit information from children, and then focus a little bit on the specific circumstances that attend interviews of very young children, and finally touch on the issue of how we go about maintaining the difficult skills that are required to conduct effective interviews with young children. So let me begin by talking about the factors that affect the informators of young witnesses. There's a huge literature on this topic, which I am going to fly through very rapidly, focusing specifically on what I consider to be the most important lessons or issues that need to be at the forefront of the attention of forensic interviewers and those evaluating interviews with young children. And I've grouped the research in terms of these four basic categories of capacity that I think make it easiest to understand and master what we know about these capacities as they affect the quality of young witnesses. So let me start by talking about the issues of memory. Perhaps the most important thing that we all know about memory is that even when an experience is encoded in memory, we begin to forget information about that almost immediately. And the longer the delay between the time the event happened and our attempt to recall it, the greater the likelihood that information will have been forgotten. Forgetting functions are very steep. They're steep for adults, and they're even steeper for young children. So we have a lot of information showing that young children, when compared with older children and adults, remember less and forget information more rapidly. What's often forgotten when thinking about that relationship, however, is the fact that there is not a comparable decline in the accuracy of information as children are younger. That is, the amount and the quality of information that children provide as 3- and 4-year-olds is just as likely to be accurate as the information provided by older children, given that they are being asked in similar ways to retrieve that information from memory. So while there is a clear and almost linear relationship between age and the amount of information recalled, there is no comparable relationship with respect to accuracy. The age-related function with respect to the amount of information recalled reveals something about the way in which memory operates. Little people forget information more rapidly and can provide access to it with greater difficulty because they don't have as many other experiences with which to store or associate any given experiences. And of course, because their understanding of the world is more limited, preventing them from appropriately encoding and recalling that information. Regardless of age, however, there's an important difference with respect to the way in which information is retrieved from any of us. When information is retrieved using recall processes, that is, when somebody is asked to tell me everything about what happened to you this morning, that information is much more likely to be accurate than information retrieved using recognition processes. That is, using questions like, did you brush your teeth? Did you put your left sock on before your right sock? Specific recognition questions like that elicit more errors because they focus the attention of the person retrieving information on aspects of an event that may not have been encoded or well remembered, whereas recall processes leave the responsibility for the memory retrieval in the hands of the person making the retrieval of information, and allows them to focus on the information that they are more confident about, that they feel that is more likely to be accurate. And I'll say a great deal in the course of this lecture about the importance of this distinction and why it behooves interviewers to rely as much as possible on recall questions rather than recognition questions when they're trying to elicit information from young children. Turning now to issues of social norms, we're all familiar from our everyday experiences with the fact that young children often feel uncomfortable when they meet new strangers, and that reticence or shyness is something that we have to overcome in order to engage in interaction with them, whether that interaction involves playing with them in a social setting, or eliciting information from them in a medical or forensic interview setting. So establishing some degree of cooperation and rapport is something that we all recognize and understand. What I think we understand less well is the extraordinary uniqueness of the forensic interview setting. Young children are very familiar with being asked questions by adults. But the questions that they're used to being asked are questions that are framed as ways of testing their knowledge or understanding. What day of the week is it today? What color are mummy's shoes? What is this vegetable called? Those sorts of questions are asked by somebody who already knows the answer, but is trying to test the child's knowledge. And the child is motivated to answer those questions correctly in order to gain social approval. Now, the forensic interview setting, by contrast, is completely different, because it's the child who's the expert. It's only the child who knows what actually happened. And it would be inappropriate and problematic for the child to look to the adult for guidance about that information. And it would also be inappropriate for the child to do what she typically does when asked questions by adults. That is, when the answer is wrong, you quickly guess at another answer until you come up with a correct one that elicits an approving response from the adult. Ensuring that the child understands the difference between these ground rules, between the situation in which she finds herself in when participating in a forensic interview, as opposed to the numerous everyday situations in which she's questioned by adults, is critical if we're going to have an effective and useful source of information in a forensic interview. Next, let's think a little bit about the issue of suggestibility, about which enormous amounts have been written over the last 25 to 30 years. One thing is very clear, and that is that young children, particularly very young children, 3 to 5-year-olds, are much more suggestible than older people. The suggestibility decreases as children grow older, although it's not sufficiently recognized, but actually that suggestibility remains a problem throughout the lifespan. All people are suggestible, not only little people, but it's a particular problem when we're talking about young children. And as a developmentalist, it's interesting, I think, to think about why it is that young children are so susceptible to suggestion. The answer lies in two of the things that I've talked about already. The first is that young children are particularly eager to gain social approval, to give the right answer, to have the person that they're interacting with think that they're smart or cooperative or nice children. And the second issue has to do with memory strength. Children, but like adults, are much more prone to suggestion when their memories, their independent memories of the event, are shaky or hazy. In those situations, they, like all of us, turn to outside supports to remind us of what the answer is. And just as many of us have learned to use Google or DuckDuckGo to ask questions when our memory is a little shaky, little children are particularly prone when they're not sure of something, not sure of what happened to them, to look for guidance and approval from the person who is questioning them. And that's why we find this particularly steep gradient in suggestibility. The last thing I want to talk about briefly has to do with language. And there are a couple of issues here that I want to draw attention to. A lot has been said about the difficulties that young children have in coming up with the vocabulary in order to adequately describe their experiences. And as a developmental psychologist, as well as a parent, this has always struck me as a kind of a bizarre argument, because in fact, young children have remarkable vocabularies. When we think about the fact that they may use their first word around 1 year of age and the first 2-word sentence around 18 months. The fact that the average 6-year-old, has a vocabulary of somewhere between 8,000 and 14,000 words suggests a pretty remarkable process of acquisition. It's not the case that children don't have adequate vocabularies to describe their experiences, although it is the case that often they'll use idiosyncratic words, perhaps words unique to their family, perhaps words unique to their particular take or understanding of a phenomenon. But it's not the case that they don't have adequate words. When communication breaks down between children and adults, it's usually, and I would say this on the basis of viewing now thousands of forensic interviews, when comprehension problems emerge, it's almost always because the adult uses words that are unfamiliar to the child, or frames them using constructions and syntax that are beyond the child's ability to understand the question being asked. So the problem is not really a matter of the child's vocabulary, rather it's a matter of the adult's willingness to understand the child's linguistic abilities, to frame questions simply and clearly, and to use the child's vocabulary in order to achieve communication with that child. Another way in which language is really important harks back to the point I made earlier about the difference between recall and recognition memory processes. There's an important difference in the course of a forensic interview between asking a child to tell me what happened to you, which is a recall-based question that places the burden on the child to describe their experiences as best they remember, as opposed to a question that asks, what was his name? Did it hurt? Did he put it in you or not? The difference between the types of recall and recognition questions is a critically important issue that has to do with the language of the interviewer, which shapes the likelihood that the child is going to be able to report and recount accurate information about her experiences. And this is something that I will come back to again as we go through this whistle-stop lecture. But let me say a little bit more now about beyond the 4 major factors that I've talked about, the age differences and the non-age differences with respect to memory, social understanding, suggestibility, and language, and talk a little bit about event characteristics, because they clearly affect the ability of individuals to remember their experiences. Simply put, events are more memorable when they are salient to the person remembering them. And there's some variety of factors that affect just how salient events are and how likely individuals are to remember them. One issue that's certainly pertinent when talking about instances of child abuse has to do with the emotional content of the event being experienced. And we know now that there isn't a linear relationship between how emotionally arousing an event was and how memorable it is. Rather, there seems to be an inverted U function, such that events need to be sufficiently attention-getting to be salient, but not too attention-getting that the individual is flooded with fear or anxiety or stress, because in both situations, there is likely to be less memory of the event. Whereas when there's an intermediate amount of emotion associated with an event, it's most likely to be remembered in some degree of detail. Second issue to bear in mind is the issue of the comprehension capacity of the child and whether or not he or she was able to understand what happened. Those of you who are forensic interviewers or have been involved in these sorts of cases know that young children may sometimes not understand the sexual component or elements of an event in which they were engaged. And so the failure to understand may lead some of those details or aspects of the event to simply not be adequately encoded or reported at the time of recall. Third, items are more likely to be remembered when they are distinctive, they're unique, when they stand out from others, whereas those that are more everyday and don't have features that make them particularly memorable are much less likely to be remembered and available for retrieval, particularly when there's a delay between the timing of the event and the timing of the retrieval. Finally, active involvement in event has an important role to play. Kids, like adults, are much less likely to remember details about an event they simply watched, as opposed to something in which they were an active participant, either one who was largely passive or one who was actively engaged in a series of interactions with a particular person. The last thing it's important to consider is the issue of repetition. Many instances of abuse, certainly almost all instances of physical abuse, and also many instances of sexual abuse, involve repeated events over time. And when similar events occur repeatedly, there are two things we can pretty well expect. The one is that individuals will remember the general outline of the common characteristics of those events, but that their memory is likely to be more skeletal because it only includes the common events. And for the same reason, it's likely not to include many of the incident-specific or occasion-specific details that can be critically important to understanding what happened to a child. So the fact that events have occurred repeatedly is both an aid for forensic interviewers who can use the general structure or skeleton as a framework around which to organize questions and retrieval of information, but also a problem to the extent that the child evolves to providing generic information about what usually happened rather than information about specific instances. So if we look at this research on children's memory, retrieval, and ability to describe these experiences, we know that there are multiple factors suggesting that despite their limitations, and there are clear limitations, children can be good witnesses, provided with interviewers follow a number of very clear and specific guidelines. Conducting the interview as soon as possible to avoid the effects of delay and forgetting, establishing rapport, making sure that the child understands their role as the expert and informant, asking simple, open questions using the child's own language, listening to what the child says and then following up with other open questions, overall avoiding closed-ended questions, and particularly avoiding suggestive or coercive questions, which threaten to compromise the quality of the child's account. So based on decades of research on these factors, and I do mean decades of research on this, there are a number of very clear guidelines that forensic interviewers will all have learned during the course of their training, however brief it's been. They've been told what sorts of questions not to ask, how they should avoid providing information that hasn't been provided by the child. Avoid asking complex or confusing or suggestive questions, and try to conduct the interview as soon as possible after the event took place. And by the same token, from that same literature, there are a number of very clear guidelines about what interviewers need to do if they want to help children be effective informants about their experiences, making sure that the child understands the ground rules, what her role is, making sure that she feels comfortable, feels she can trust the person who's interviewing her, giving her an opportunity to practice retrieving an account of an experienced event and then presenting it in a narrative fashion, not simply piecemeal in response to closed-ended questions. Being given the opportunity to raise the topic of abuse rather than being coerced into making an allegation. And overall, being faced with an interviewer who asks recall questions that allows the child to be the guide to the flow of information rather than letting the interviewer being the person do that. Now, this kind of guidance has been provided to forensic interviewers for a very long time. And for an almost equally long time, many researchers, including myself and my colleagues, have been looking at what interviewers actually do in the interviews they conduct. And as you can see from this quick summary in the slide here, the reality is that despite familiarity with these basic do's and don'ts, there's only one broad rule that most interviewers comply with. Most interviewers make some often quite desultory effort to establish rapport with the child. But beyond that, you see that the majority of interviews involve very limited compliance with these very broad sorts of guidelines that I've been summarizing for you here. Another way of thinking about what interviewers are doing in their interviews involves looking at the dynamics of investigative interviews by focusing on the specific questions that are being asked and the specific answers that children are being given. This has been a technique that we've used in a lot of our own research. So I want to spend a little moment to, first of all, describe the different types of utterances. I use that term rather than question because some of them are technically not questions. They can be used by interviewers to elicit information. And they're organized on the slide here in a hierarchy. At the top end are the types of prompts that are most recall-based and are therefore most effective at eliciting free recall responses from children, responses that are most likely to be accurate. And as you go down the list, you come to questions, first directive questions that are still recall-focused, but nevertheless are narrower and therefore are likely to elicit less information and involve some involvement of the interviewer. So there's a heightened potential for error, through to the more risky questions, the option-posing questions, which force the child to choose between a series of options provided by an interviewer, including, of course, yes/no questions. And finally, the most problematic questions, suggestive questions, which explicitly communicate to the child what type of response is expected. And in a typical study, one of several that we've conducted and not dissimilar from studies conducted by many other researchers now over the years, you see a pattern of results, something like that shown in this slide here. If we look at the different types of questions asked by interviewers in a large sample of interviews, you see that there is very limited use of open-ended invitations, quite a lot of use of the directive questions, but that somewhere between 40 and 50% of the questions being asked of young children in these non-selected interviews involve risky questions. The ones that I call risky because they have a much higher risk of eliciting inaccurate information from children. So what we see here is a reflection of what I said earlier, that interviewers, despite their training, don't seem to be doing a good job of asking the right sorts of questions of children. Now, of course, we also are interested in what the children are saying in response. And for the purposes of research, we've tried to quantify their responses in terms of the number of details that children provide in their responses. And the key thing to draw your attention to is that in our research, we only count a detail once, the first time it's presented. If a detail is repeated, that doesn't get counted again. And if we use that and look at the responses provided by children, you see again a pattern that is quite problematic, that very few of the details provided in these average interviews are elicited in response to open-ended questions, while a substantial number, somewhere between a third and 40 or so %, are details that are by definition somewhat risky because of the way they've been elicited from children. The depressing conclusion is that interviewers appear not to implement their best practices, even when they know what they should be doing, and even when they think they're complying. And I can certainly attest to that, having looked at interviews over many years, conducted by interviewers who participated in extensive training sessions, interviewers who could very effectively summarize what the rules were, who would swear blind that they never ask suggestive questions and that they always give priority to open questions. But in fact, when push comes to shove, when they're sitting there in front of a child, they have a great deal of difficulty in doing that. And it was this depressing realization that led my colleagues and I to develop the NICHD investigative interview protocol. As I've often said, this protocol was not a result of inspiration. It was really a result of desperation and frustration. We found, as many others have found, that general principle training simply doesn't bring about effective or extensive changes in what people actually do in the interview. And that led us to try to develop this structured, detailed guidance that we hoped would allow interviewers to better navigate interviews with young children. And over time, we've conducted a series of studies in which we try to compare interviews conducted using and not using the protocol, with the children involved in these interviews being comparable with respect to all of the factors that we know are relevant to interview quality, particularly having to do with the nature of the relationship between the child and the suspected perpetrator, the age of the child, and so on. And in an exemplary study, and I only want to present results from one, we've obtained results like those shown in this slide here, comparing 50 interviews conducted by a group of police interviewers in the US who've been trained to use the protocol with a comparable group of 50 interviews conducted by those same interviewers immediately before the time that they had been trained to use the protocol. And what you see here is that even though we're focusing on the first 50 interviews conducted after training, that there's been a dramatic increase in the use of invitations and a substantial decrease, though by no means an elimination of the use of risky questions. If we look at the children's responses, the results look even more impressive. Once the interviewers were using the protocol, the amount of information they elicited using open-ended questions increased to almost half, whereas the amount of information elicited using these riskier questions declined substantially. So there seemed to be pretty good evidence that even in the immediate aftermath of training, their interviews were hewing closer to the guidelines that emerged from the evidence-based protocol or general principles that the research supported. Even these interviewers, and certainly any other interviewers that I've encountered, always feel that while they can manage with open-ended questions with older children, that younger children have more difficulty responding to invitations. And so we've tried to look very hard at the performance of much younger children. And I present here some illustration from a study comparing 54-year-olds and 58-year-olds experiencing similar kinds of abuse interviewed by the same group of interviewers. And there are really 2 points I want to draw your attention to in this slide here. The first is that you see that whether you're talking about the 4-year-olds or the 8-year-olds, roughly half of the information, slightly more from the 8-year-olds, was elicited in response to open-ended questions. So yes, even 4-year-olds can respond to open-ended questions. But looking at the top of the slide, you see here that the 8-year-olds provided many more details in total than the 4-year-olds. A not surprising function, as we talked about earlier. Older children remember and can recall much more information about their experiences than younger ones. And so it's important, of course, to titrate experiences in relation to how much information a child can be expected to remember. Another way of looking at that information is presented in this slide here, where we've showed the average number of new details retrieved in response to invitation by children of these different ages. And you see this very nice developmental trend. The older the child, the more likely they are to include multiple details in their narrative responses to questions. But even the 4-year-olds are able to give detailed, though rather brief responses. And of course, that's the problem that interviewers have. The 4-year-old's response tends to be quite brief, and therefore the ball is back in the interviewer's court much more rapidly. And in the search for the next question, many interviewers fall back on closed-ended and riskier questions rather than formulating a follow-up question that is open. It is important to recognize that even younger children have a slightly more difficulty dealing with very open-ended questions. And I want to just present 2 bits of information from a study showing this. The first one looks at the proportion of questions to which children gave an on-track appropriate response. And you see here that the 3 and 4, but especially the 3-year-olds, were much less likely to give on-track responding to the very open-ended questions, and did much better when they were asked these more narrowly focused, recall-based directive questions. And that's also true, same study, if we look at the extent to which the response provided new details. You see that the invitations quite seldom elicited new details from these very young children, but were much more likely to do so when we spoke about the slightly older children. So the general points here are that even though 3-year-olds can be informative witnesses and can respond to open-ended questions, they're not always the most efficient or the most effective ways of eliciting information from these very young kids, who may benefit when interviewers engage in using prompts that scaffold the child better, and while still eliciting recall-based information, provide the structure or scaffold that allow these children to provide as much information. The point is that it's really important then for children to use best quality interviewing in order to elicit useful information from them. And the sad reality is that despite decades of research and despite decades of investment in training, there are very few agencies and very few countries that are providing the adequate, appropriate, necessary forms of training that allow the judicial system and, I would say, the child protective services to provide appropriate evidence-based interventions to protect children. Now, I've already talked about the fact that it's very difficult to develop interviewing skills. We know from many studies that general principle training often doesn't lead to a change in practice. And it's also fair to say that even when a change in practice has been achieved, it's often difficult to get interviewers to maintain those interviewing skills. And I want to illustrate this with results from a couple of studies that we conducted. The first one I want to talk about is related to the study I presented to you earlier, showing the effectiveness of the protocol in an American police department. But here I want to focus on a subset of the cases involving the protocol in order to show you what happened to these police officers' performance over time. The first pie chart on the left shows what they were doing before being introduced to the protocol. The second shows what they were doing when they were participating in the study and were implementing use of the protocol. And as I described to you earlier, after they had conducted 50 interviews, they were told that the study was over and they were no longer being given regular meetings and guidance on their interviews by the researchers and by the local supervisors. And we continued to monitor the interviews, and what's shown in the last or right-hand slide shows what happened in the 37 interviews they conducted after the end of the study, with cases that were comparable to 37 of the interviews that get conducted using the protocol. And I think the slides show a pretty clear picture that as soon as they stopped having regular discussions with the researchers and with their supervisors about each of their interviews, they started using fewer open-ended questions, and they started using more of the risky questions that they had stopped using in the course of training. So what we see here is, I think, a sort of decline in adherence to the protocol during the time that there was less focus on whether or not they were adhering to it. And that underlines, I think, the importance of having regular opportunities to review interviews with peers and supervisors. And that point is made best by looking at the next slide, which focuses on interviews that are conducted by a group of interviewers whose agency continued to have regular meetings with them after they had completed training. So each of these interviewers regularly met with a supervisor and with other interviewers and reviewed the interviews that each of them had conducted. Not all of them, but an exemplary 1 or 2 interviews each month to review what they'd done, what they did well, what they might have done differently. And what you see here, I think, is that compared to the results of the previous slides, there was a continued increase in the use of open-ended questions, a comparable use of directive questions, the elimination of most option-posing questions, and most importantly, not a single suggestive question asked by any of these interviewers in any of their interviews. And if we look not just at what the interviewers were doing, but at the product of those interviews, we achieve what I think are rather extraordinary results here. That on average, 83% of the information provided by the children came in response to open-ended invitations, with an additional 16% in response to the directive recall questions, only 1% in response to option-posing questions, and no information in response to suggestive questions. So what this illustrates, I think, is just how important it is to continue providing extended peer and supervisory review. Skills aren't achieved and maintained on their own. One has to working on reviewing, examining, self-criticizing, and having others criticize that product. And only in that situation do we find that the quality of interviewing is maintained. So let me come to some overall conclusions so we can open up for some questions. The points I've tried to make today is that I think children can be informative witnesses, and that's true even of the very youngest children, but that the critical issue has to do with the quality of training of the interviewers. Effective interview practice can be taught. I guess I'd argue that it has to be taught. And the only way we can get interviewers to maintain high quality interviewing practices is by ensuring that they continue to review and evaluate those interviews over time. And that's an important point, because if you do good interviews, if you elicit good information from children, you're in a much better place to make clear decisions about whether to prosecute, about whether to intervene in a family. And when typical interviews, which involve using lots of risky and inappropriate practices, are used, we're left much less sure about the conclusions we can reach, and therefore much less well-placed, what a term, to intervene effectively. The big problem is that in most cases of sexual abuse, children are the only available sources of information about whether they've been victimized. Less true for physical abuse because there are often physical signs there, but it's children who are usually the important ones who can provide the contextual information. And the sad reality, especially with respect to sexual abuse, is that most suspected incidents of abuse don't lead to any effective intervention. They don't lead to criminal charges. They don't lead to supportive service provisions for families. And the key reason, I would argue, is that most agencies are still not investing sufficiently in the quality of their forensic interviews. And in the absence of high quality forensic interviews, we're left usually not knowing what happened to the child. And that's a tragedy for the child, a tragedy for the family, and a tragedy for the system. So let me stop there. Thank you for your attention. I've put my email address here so that if you want to shoot me questions that you didn't get answered today, then please feel free to send them to me. And you'll find a much more detailed, with references, summary of this literature in the book that's referenced in this page. So thank you, Julie, and I'm ready to take any questions that might have come in.
All right, thank you so much. We do have a number of questions. The first is, what additional considerations come into play when interviewing children with autism? And do you know who's doing research in that area?
Yeah, great question. We did a number of studies that were published in the last 2 or 3 years that looked at children with autism. You might look for Telma Almeida, Almeida, for reports of those studies. Like most studies of children with autism, they involved children who were high functioning, so they were verbal. I suppose the summary point would be that these children function pretty much as well as typically developing children, and coped well with the same types of protocol-guided questions that we've been talking about here. Obviously, there are some children on the spectrum who have particular needs that would have to be taken into account, and that might involve the need to have a preparatory discussion with a clinician, somebody familiar with the child, to know a little bit more about the factors that would be particularly important for that child. The degree of structure in the situation, perhaps the need for more breaks. But as a general rule, actually, high-functioning kids with autism seem remarkably capable of providing accounts of their experiences.
Next question is, so some experts in criminal court review evidentiary interviews of children who have disclosed abuse. At times, they'll say that leading questions were used, and therefore the information obtained from the child should be questioned or not believed. Do you have any suggestions for how an attorney or expert could challenge the certainty of this position?
Well, as I've argued today, that claim is based on the reality that information elicited using risky questions and leading questions are inherently risky because they introduce information and they are suggestive by nature. So one has to consider that information to be somewhat suspect. But I would say two things beyond that. The first is that while a suggestive question can contaminate the child's response, it doesn't contaminate any information the child has already provided. And that's why for a long time we've always recommended that if you're going to ask a risky question, ask it as late as possible in the interview, because you minimize the damage that it causes. If you start the interview with a suggestion, if you effectively tell the child that she was abused, then you have a bigger problem than if you ask those sorts of questions much later. The second thing I would say is that it's really important to look at the interview in its entirety, not only the timing of interviews, but at the nature of the response. It is more problematic if the child simply acquiesces to a suggestive question, so is not providing any information on her own volition, as opposed to a situation where the child answers a suggestive question, but then proceeds to volunteer a lot of additional information that wasn't suggested. So I think that it is critically important to look at the interview in its entirety, to look at the information, to see when it was produced, and to understand, I suppose, the extent to which the problematic question caused damage. And I do think there is a tendency, which is implied by the questioner, for some experts to exaggerate the impact of a bad question and to not engage in a complete holistic analysis of the whole of the interview and all the information provided.
Are there times when you believe that suggestive questions can be helpful? If there's strong evidence that abuse occurred, maybe you have it on video or audio, or the individual has a sexually transmitted infection, and the child continues to deny anything, what kind of question would be acceptable to elicit a true disclosure about abuse?
Well, let me begin by making one observation, that I think a lot of forensic interviewing and a lot of guidance has been presented with criminal prosecution as the overriding goal. And to the extent that the child's testimony is required to achieve it, I would say that you shouldn't be asking suggestive questions. To the extent that you don't really need the child's testimony, such as in the cases that you've just described, then the risk is much less of leaving a child unprotected as a result of inappropriate questioning strategies. So what my worry is that people decide that they are in that situation where they need to ask the suggestive question much more often than they really are in a situation where they need to ask that question. The situations where there is a sexually transmitted disease are quite rare. Most of the times I see suggestive questions being asked are when the interviewer is convinced, but where, in my opinion, the evidence is by no means clear that they should be convinced that the child was abused. So I think we have to be really cautious and to beware of this slippery slope.
You have spoke of experts and suggestibility, but regarding children's responses, are there other characteristics, for example, different personality types that affect the situation when you're retrieving information from them?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the child's personality is going to be important. We talked a little bit about the special circumstances of children on the autism spectrum. Certainly kids with other kinds of known syndromes have characteristics that one would need to take into account, particularly syndromes that may be associated with, say, higher susceptibility to suggestion, like Down syndrome. And there are normal features of personality. So I talked briefly about rapport building, but certainly some kids may be particularly slow to warm up, may be particularly fearful, may have experienced particularly traumatic experiences that need to be addressed more carefully. I did not have time today in this whirlwind lecture to talk about our work on the revised protocol, which is much more focused on the developing a rapport between the interviewer and the child, and where we've shown that, in some cases, with some children, it's beneficial and necessary to extend an interview over 2 sessions so that you have more time to develop a reasonable degree of rapport, a trusting bond between the interviewer and the child. So being an evidence-based person, I would say you take that route rather than moving to a suggestive question. And yes, it is really important to recognize the individual characteristics of children and to work with those as an interviewer.
Are recording of all interviews mandated?
To my knowledge, they're not mandated. They vary by jurisdiction. Some agencies do require recording of interviews, and others do not. I've never understood why not. I can think of no good reason why a forensic interview shouldn't be recorded. And I can think of lots of good reasons why not recording it is problematic, including the one that I dealt with at the end of my talk, which is that you need those in order to review what you did. People's memories of what they did in the interview are incredibly fallible. We are not good at reporting of what we did, folks. And in particular, we're not good at reporting how many leading questions, exactly how that information was elicited from a child, etc. Only a recording can tell us that. So, you know, I've argued now for 30 odd years how important it is to record interviews. And I'm glad that more places now are recording. I think the majority of jurisdictions in the US record, although I don't have any sight for that, so that may be wrong.
Real quick, everyone, it is past the hour, so if you do need to jump off for your next meeting, now is the time. Make sure you fill out the CE survey, but we are going to stay on for a little bit longer to address a few more questions. So the next question is, if a child is abused multiple times over the course of months or years, what impact does that have on the distinctiveness of memory for the child and the ability to recall specifics of the abuse? How might you advise interviewers and attorneys for addressing this in their work? For example, evidentiary questions asked of the child, or asking questions of the child or expert in trial.
Yeah, I passed over that very quickly, of course, but that's clearly a problem, because when a child has been repeatedly abused, there is a tendency for the child to develop a skeletal account of the average incident, what typically happened, what usually happened. And that more generic account is, as I said, both less detailed and doesn't contain the specific details or the links to specific dates and times, to the extent that that particularization is necessary for prosecution. There have been a number of studies, particularly by Sonja Brubacher and her colleagues, and I would urge you to look at those for details about this issue. But I think in general, I suggest that it's valuable to use the generic account, the script, to help as a framework and to allow the child to describe specific incidents in relation to, that is, in distinction from what happens in the generic situation. But in order to get rich details, it is important to get the child to talk about specific incidents. When a child has been repeatedly interviewed, I would argue you're never going to get details about all of those incidents, and that one should try and focus on the ones that are most likely to be individually recognized, which would be the first time, the last time, which is often associated with the disclosure, and perhaps some particularly well-remembered ones in between that involved some distinctive additional characteristics. And then it becomes critically important for the interviewer to make sure that her questions are specific questions, and that the child's responses are specific rather than generic. And I see interviewers often failing to do that monitoring. And so the child slips back into the generic. And what tends to happen is that the interviewer slips along with them and they become generic, rather than the interviewer trying to pull the child back. So it's a challenging thing to do, but I think it's very important if we want to get those very rich, particularized details about events.
Would you recommend using similar interviewing techniques with adults with developmental disabilities, or taking a different approach?
I would recommend using the same approach. Most of the principles of the NICHD protocol are true of memory. The particular structuring and the particular wording that we put into the guidance is designed for children. But we know, for example, that even if you're talking about adolescence, you want to change the terminology to make it more appropriate. And you'd certainly want to do that with an adult as well. But in terms of the general structure and the general principles that are built into the protocol, and that are built into actually all of our understanding of interviewing, independent of the protocol, are relevant when you're talking about adults with developmental delays too.
While timely interviewing is best practice, we know that many children don't disclose abuse until many months or even years after the abuse occurred. How do you suggest that we best educate the trier of fact about the impact that delayed disclosures can have on the information disclosed by the child?
Well, I would say two things. The first is, of course, expert witnesses are available to describe that information, and it's that certainly happens much more often in the US than it does, say, in the UK, where it's much less common to have experts brought in. But I would also say, and I don't think I'm just being facetious, that all of us know that we forget information. And I think that's something that triers of fact need to be reminded about in the course of a trial, even if it's not produced by an expert witness. I've been working with the judiciary in the UK to try and get some of these basic principles incorporated into jury instructions, because they're not controversial. There's nobody in the world arguing that we remember more about things the more time that passes. So why not include that as something that we remind people of?
Does the quality of the child's recall change with repeated interviews? Say the police interview them, then a social worker, then a psychologist, et cetera.
This it's a really interesting question, that, and I think the evidence is a bit mixed. But part of what seems to happen is that the child's account becomes more and more simplified. It starts to sound more like a script, and therefore seems less persuasive, less credible than the initial account, which may be quite halting and may involve, may be co-constructed over time in the course of an interview. I think that's why there's been such pressure over the last 25 years to reduce the number of interviews. I think it's fair to say that kids are now interviewed less than they used to be, but still more often than they should be. and that there needs to be more shared use of those procedures. But there is the risk that through repeated telling, and of course, as a result of the passage of time, that the account is going to start to sound different, perhaps be less compelling than it was initially. And that's a problem for the, particularly for those cases that go to trial.
Can you give an example of how to ask about possible penetration for a young child without being suggestive or leading?
Well, I think it's really, I can't out of context, because I think it really depends on what the child has said to you, and how you need to build around that by asking the child to provide more detailed information about that. And if, as in many jurisdictions, it is critically important to know whether or not there was penetration, and the child has not disclosed that in the course of an open-ended interview in response to lots of opportunities, then that's a question you might ask at the very end, and by trying to use as to damage the response as little as possible. Tell me exactly what he did to you, as opposed to asking, did he stick it in you? So I mean, I think when constructing an interview, particularly when you reach the end, when you've had a lot of open-ended narrative and you're down to the last few details, and for some reason you can't get those details to be reported by the child, you have to ask risky questions. And I would say that the critical thing at that point is to ask your risky question with as limited risk as possible. One of the things that we've tried to encourage interviewers to do is to take a break, and if necessary, take 2 breaks. That allows you to pull your thoughts together, to talk to a colleague, to see what you're missing, and to see if 2, 3 heads together can think of what might be the question we could ask that would get that critical information we need, for example, about penetration, in the least risky way. And I do think, although we've never actually systematically looked at this, that we get less risky questions from people who do take the break, because instead of just blundering in with the first thought that comes to their head, and as in this talk, so in any interview, the first thought that comes into your head is often not the smartest way of saying things. That allows you to improve the quality of your question.
All right, we are 15 minutes past, so I think this is a good place to stop. Thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it. This was fantastic.
Not at all. You have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye. All right, everyone, grab your links. We're going to sign off in just a minute. Thank you.
Thank you, folks. I'm going to end it now. Have a wonderful rest of your day.